Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Garuda podcast. The book we are discussing today is called Project Omega: The Future of Life in the Solar System. And with me is Professor Menas Kafatos, and I might not have quite spelled it correctly, but I'm going to introduce him and maybe have Menas. Could you first tell us how we pronounce your name exactly right, so I don't mess it up?
Thank you, Sankrant. My name is pronounced Menas Kafatos. It's Greek, and
Absolutely. So Menas Kafatos is based in California. If you could give us a little bit of a background for Indian viewers, Menas, who might not know of you, that would be wonderful.
yes, thank you. I'm based in California, and now I'm based in California. We have three different places where you can find me. One is, of course, here in the west coast of the United States. Another place is Greece, and the third place is South Korea.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so I travel a lot, and here is, of course, it's January, and we're going to the end of January 2026.
Well, we'll have to have you stop over in India in one of your cross-continental trips.
I have been to India several times, not recently, but and um, I believe Professor Kak mentioned that I do have interest in Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, and in Kashmir Shaivism. And we can talk a little
Absolutely.
bit more about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And a little bit more formal bio, Menas Kefatos is the Fletcher Jones Endowed Professorship of Computational Physics and Director, Institute for Earth Computing, Human and Observing, ECHO at Chapman University. Is the author and editor of 25 books, including the New York Times bestseller, You Are the Universe, co authored with Deepak Chopra. So, this is such a stellar background. So wonderful to have you, Manas. And I'm very, very especially struck with the remark you just made of your interest in Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism. Now, as physicists go, I think there's a long history of this, is it not? Especially in quantum physicists, right from Schrodinger and many people in the turn of the 20th century. Can you tell me a little bit about that and also a little bit about how you got into it?
Sure. Erwin Schrödinger, of course, was a follower of Vedanta, and he's a well-known quantum physicist. We know the Schrödinger equation, which is the wave equation of quantum physics. So we can talk a little bit about quantum physics and general relativity, which are my background in science. But in terms of, if I may venture a little bit into philosophy, and by that I include um, Vedanta and Shaiva, Kashmir Shaivism. I also include ancient Greece, the teachings of Socrates and Platon, or Plato, as it's called in the West, and Aristotle or Aristoteles, which is in Greek. These are great thinkers of ancient times. And one may say, well, what does a physicist in the 21st century have to do with these ancient teachings? Philosophy, if I may call it in general, which is philosophy is a Greek word. It comes from friend of wisdom, philos, and Sophia, friend of wisdom. And but the principles, if you like, of understanding the universe, and most importantly, trying to understand ourselves, is consciousness based. So we can talk a little bit more about that. In other words, if we can call it mind with a capital M, is the foundation of everything.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of exchange. In fact, one of the interests that I've personally had, and we've published a lot of books in this area from Garuda Prakashan, the publishing house, is there is a relationship of ancient Greece and ancient India. and there's a rich exchange happening. And I know even Pythagoras possibly went to India, and then Socrates has influenced, there's mutual influence across philosophical schools, that is
Absolutely, absolutely,
happening
yes. Yeah, there
very
was
early.
a close connection between India and Greece, or maybe even more specifically Athens, because a lot of the Greek thought or the Greek philosophy comes from Athens. And Aristotle himself was, if I may call him the father of science, he was also very much interested in ethics. And it's sort of strange to think of a scientist being interested in ethics, but today, particularly, in our current time, in 2026, with the way things are going, the ethical behavior has become even more important, perhaps, than we had realized.
In fact, I would say that from a traditional point of view, their dissociation is more surprising than their association. because because from the point of the Indian yogis or rishis who were investigating different phenomenon, or from the point of the Greeks, you couldn't really keep aside ethics and then go into science for without having consciousness about how it's going to impact uh, the world.
Absolutely. But very often in the West, let me just call it the West versus the East. In
Sure.
the West, we make the assumption, which may actually turn out to not be correct, that everything is in some ways is mechanical.
Right.
And that goes back to Isaac Newton or before him. But it turns out that Newton himself was very much into consciousness. He was a great thinker, and it's not really, when we say Newtonian physics, in some ways it doesn't really represent Newton. In many ways, Newton was more of a quantum physicist. And we can talk a little bit about quantum. What is quantum physics? What is the idea of interaction with the observer, with the observed, which is the foundation, in fact, of everything. Uh, who is um, who is myself? Who is yourself? Who are we? These are deep questions that go back to ancient times. And in our book with Professor Subhash Kak, the Omega, the Project Omega, we go into these quote unquote speculations, but they're not really speculations. They are the eternal questions that have been there since the beginning.
Yes, and this whole, you talk about this materialistic uh, notion of the universe, which has been a part of some, I would say, one strand of Western thought, if you don't want to say all of the West.
Correct. Correct.
One major strand of Western thoughts then begins possibly after the Enlightenment and the secularization of society, and that strand gets challenged in a way when the quantum physics discoveries come around. And for me, as somebody who's been a student of science and engineering, but not really somebody who studied it to the great extent that you have, it always struck me when I first encountered Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that you know uh, if you take Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the Gödel's incompleteness theorem together, it seems that that whole model actually, the Descartesian deterministic model actually falls apart with those two ideas quite rapidly. And then perhaps the only possibility of learning when you can't have a observer from the outside look at the particle without changing it is having a sentient particle, which can self-observe. So
In some ways, we are those sentient particles, particles in the more general sense than an individual atom or individual
right.
particle in the quantum sense. But quantum theory really is the perhaps the most successful theory we have. It's actually amazing, and I'll come back in just a little bit to Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. It is so profoundly important. I mean, for example, the uh, machines or the tools we use, which are the smartphones, they're based on quantum physics. Most things in life, in fact, are based on quantum physics. People don't realize that when they hear the word quantum, they run away and they say, "Oh, this is not for me." But in fact, the majority of our devices, in some ways, use quantum principles, quantum physics. So, what is the foundation of the quantum? Quantum comes from Latin. It means a chunk of something, but in this case, I mean quantum of energy. And what is so special about quantum theory? Well, what is really special about quantum theory is the eternal questions that we have since antiquity, since Advaita Vedanta, excuse me, and Kashmir Shaivism in India, and in Greece, the Platonic ideas and Aristotle. We have the notion that the universe can be known with tremendous accuracy. And it is interesting that the uncertain principle of Heisenberg actually um, tells us that the universe, even though in its foundation is uncertain, quote unquote, in fact, this uncertainty is not true. I mean, it's not real in the sense of stopping our understanding of the universe. The uncertainty has to do with physical entities, physical parameters such as um, the way a particle moves from one side to the other. In a quantum well, for example, in a quantum, um, depth, so to speak. And the other twin or the other side of science is general relativity. And it's an amazingly accurate in the largest sense of the universe, because the universe is truly general relativistic. So this all these ideas, I'm throwing all kinds of concepts here, but they come from science, but they're founded in both India and Greece, ancient Greece, and I would say also in the Far East, in China, and because it's not just the prerogative of or the um, possession of this knowledge is not cannot be found in just one place, but it is universal.
Absolutely. In fact, and not only is it universal, there's all this rich exchange, as we said, between Greece and India, and of course between India and China.
Correct.
There's this multi-century, multi-millennia exchange of ideas that is happening. And in fact, I remember I was in Xi'an one time, and they have this wild goose pagoda, and
Hmm.
the wild goose pagoda is 7 stories high. So my daughter and I, they said there was a grand treasure on top of the pagoda. So my daughter and I, we climbed all the 7 stories looking
Oh my
at what
gosh!
we would find the treasure. And it turns
Right.
out that the treasure on top is the Sanskrit manuscripts that Sang brought from India to China. And they have
Yeah.
preserved this over centuries as one of their great wealths that they have in China.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So in fact, the wisdom of China is connected very much to the wisdom of India, through specifically the great philosophy of Buddhism.
yes,
And of course, Lord Buddha was an enlightened being, very much in the Indian tradition. It's actually bringing up this issue of enlightenment. I'm of course a great admirer of ancient Greece, but I would say that in India, specifically, the the idea, um, which becomes a desire of the wise person, is to know oneself. And this idea of the wisdom is timeless. It spans space and time, goes beyond um, our immediate future. And in the book with Professor Subhash Kak, the Project Omega, we're actually talking about the future of humanity. Because from astronomy, we know that eventually what we see around us is going to end. And when there is a beginning, there's always end, the alpha and the omega, the first and the last. And in some ways, many, specifically the project omega, is about the end, but if there is an end, there is a beginning, and there is
Right.
in between.
And from the Indian tradition, there is an end and there is a beginning, and the end is a beginning. It's
Correct.
always the beginning of one more kalpa, one more yuga, and then you
Exactly. The
complete
yugas,
the
and
cycle.
the yugas,
Yeah.
as you well know, they keep one after the other. Yuga, of course, means an interval of time. Right now, we are into Kali Yuga, which is characterized by strife, if I can call it that. But the good news is that after Kali Yuga is Satya Yuga. Satya Yuga meaning truth, being. It's interesting that in India, truth and being are almost synonymous. And differentiating, if I may, the wisdom, which I like not to do, but let's just for the sake of our discussion, I would say that the Indian rishis, the Indian wisdom um, passers who pass the knowledge from ancient times, from the Vedas um, to Shaiva to Kashmir Shaivism, they paid a lot of attention to the issue of where do we come from and where are we going, in the sense of these deep questions that are timeless. So actually, this brings up the whole issue of space and time, and we can talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the chapters, the book we are talking about is called Project Omega, The Future of Life in the Solar System by Professor Subhash Kak and Professor Menas Kafatos, who I have with me. And one of the chapters is Ancient Wisdom and Cosmic Consciousness, in which you're delving into the issues. And there is so much to talk about here, both in terms of the issue of mind that you bring up. But I've always personally had this whole curiosity with the Western, or at least let's say mechanistic model of creation. Um, and the way, at least I distilled it for my understanding, was that there is a model in which you say matter arises, it becomes sufficiently complex, and that sufficient complex matter exhibits consciousness, right? Or the other possibility is that consciousness is the preeminent existence, and from consciousness, perhaps if not matter but the perception of matter, the senses arise, and then you start to perceive this, which might very well be a dream state. We can presume that. So on the first one, it seems it's it's actually very unproven scientifically. I mean, I have not seen an experiment that says, look, we take these inert particles and we stir them long enough and then they exhibit consciousness. Um, so so that one, it doesn't seem to me, at least from my naive view, to be very scientific. But the fact that consciousness uh, can create the perception of matter, at the very least happens in our dream state, whether or not it is happening in this cosmic dream, that one way that the Indian traditions talk about the reality is. So
You're absolutely right. In fact, the great rishis, the great philosophers, they talked. I put it in the past, but actually it's true even today, that reality is like a dream. It's a dream-like, and in the ancient gurus or the ancient teachers, their teachings are still very valid. They refer to reality as a dream. And in fact, they say again that what we think is all reality, namely the awakened state, turns out to be the weakest of them all. And there are four states. The first one is awake state, which we are right now. The second one is the dream state, the situation or the state of dreams that we have every night, depending on where we are. And the third state is the deep sleep state, The deep sleep state, we are aware afterwards that we were in the dream state, in the deep sleep state. When we say, well, I had an amazing, refreshing night, depending on where we are, it's night or it may be day for somebody else. But the most important one is the fourth one, which is the state of absolute existence, or the state of meditation, if I may call it that. Um, and there's
Turiya.
actually
Turiya is the Sanskrit
Turiya,
for that.
Turiya,
Yeah.
and actually there is, as you know, there's another one which is called Turiya Tita, which is beyond the Turiya,
Mhm.
and that is the cosmic existence. But in between the dream state and the deep sleep state, there is another state which I interest in very much, which is the lucid dreams.
Mm.
And the lucid dreams, as the words indicate, they're light, they're full of light. The lucidity is light. And it is actually quite amazing state when you find yourself, if you remember, if you can hold the memory to when you wake up. And from my own experience, a lucid dream is something you never forget. It's so it's in between. It's between the dream state and the deep sleep state. And from quantum physics, we know that it is in the between that
Mm.
actually the whole action happens, in between awake state and dream state, between dream state and deep sleep state, and most importantly, between deep sleep state and the Turiya state. So ultimately, our true state is the Turiya. It is the state of meditation. And it is, we owe to the ancient rishis, to the ancient Indian philosophers that gave that idea, who gave us the idea that we're beyond just the physical appearance, or the physical, what we consider the physical existence. But and I want to hear from you. It is so prevalent in our world today that we think nothing else exists except the physical. And this is so far removed from true reality that is actually pretty amazing.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there is this other word that comes up, Maya, which we can talk about. But even in there, I see there are so many layers. So there is one level of sleep that I have in my waking state, and then when I'm plugged into social media and into my gadgets, I'm going into, or when I'm playing a video game. So I'm going from this normal state of sleeping where I'm mostly unaware of things into even a deeper level of unawareness, being hooked into another world, so to say, which where we can see it's an imaginary world, right? But this one, we it's the same thing here too, except that we don't see it, that we are
It's
also plugged into a video game.
That's right. It is actually against some of these statements from the ancient rishis, is that the whole thing is a game.
Right,
It's a game or a play of consciousness. If I may paraphrase one of the great teachers of India, who is Swami Muktananda, who was talking about this play of consciousness, but consciousness with a capital C, to distinguish from regular consciousness, if I may call it, or capital M, the mind, versus the small mind that we have. So we think, and the word "think" keeps coming in again.
right.
We think we're finite beings. We're just the physical body. Today we live maybe at most 100 years if we're lucky. Unfortunately, because of everything that's going on, sometimes our life is cut much shorter. And particularly for young people, this causes a lot of not just uncertainty, but fear, because not knowing what is next is something that is very fearsome. But approaching it from, if I may call it, from purely cold scientific way of approach, we know that space and time itself, um, space time in general relativity, one word, is not really everything. Space and time sort of reverse each other. We think of time as being one dimensional from the past to the future. But in fact, in some modern physics theories, which are not necessarily accepted by everybody, but in science, you have to give everything. Um,
That's right.
time, right? Time can be three-dimensional, and space be one-dimensional. So they reverse each other, and the reversal takes place inside a black hole. So a
Mm,
black hole is the ultimate limit, as the two words indicate, black hole, of everything disappearing into nothingness. In fact, what happens is they don't disappear, or everything does not disappear into nothingness, but emerges into what we call, many people today call, the multiverse. And the
mm,
multiverse is a reality that holds many universes together. How many universes? It could be infinite. It could be a very, very large number. And
right.
so we can speculate a little bit about that.
And it's very fascinating. I don't know if you've seen read this text, the Yoga Vashishta,
Of
which
course, yes.
which is really one of the most mind blowing of even of Indian texts, because it goes from one dimension, it drops in and it drops in, and you have all that, the Inception movie, I think, borrowed from it also in some ways, where it really starts to make you question what is this reality, and what is the realm of reality, when you can drop from one realm into another, and just kind of keep going down this hole, and then you pop back up, and then the story continues on on another plane, and so on and so forth. So I think this, both time and reality, are so fundamental concepts in physics as well as in the Indian tradition, because
Correct.
one of the sort of naive questions is what somebody learns, the Big Bang theory is, the first question a child asks is, okay, what was before the Big Bang? Right? And of course, when we say, well, time itself comes as a result of that. And then I know there is this, I think it's the Rig Veda one, where it says, who knows, like there is the stillness, and there is the one, and maybe the one knows, and maybe the one doesn't know either. So there's this whole embracing of the unknown too, I think, is very, very fascinating. And you were talking about the young people being confused about, okay, this is this one life, what's going to happen, and then you can choose all these alternatives. Some standardized religious answers tell you you're going to eternity in one place or another place, which creates its own set of fears and anxiety around that, which I've seen when I've talked to people who really believe that they're going to hell, for instance, or going to
Right.
heaven. you know
Or for that matter, of paradise.
yeah, or
You know,
paradise. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, you you
it's the
you
same thing.
create the same delusion either way, or
Correct.
delusion. I probably shouldn't call it delusion, but the same. The mind kind of clings on to that as the hope or the way, and then in that quest for paradise, you create hell on earth sometimes. So that's a whole other problem. But coming back to time and reality, is this word reality, you mentioned truth. I think the right translation for sat is probably the real, more than truth. um, and
Correct.
and in that sense, the quest for Satchidananda is this reality consciousness and moving towards bliss. um, so, but coming back to the book, we also talk about whether complexity leads to consciousness. So you have a whole chapter on artificial intelligence, and I'd
Correct.
love to hear your thoughts on that. And again, people should pick up the book. It goes much, much deeper. Project Omega: The Future of Life in the Solar System. um, so is artificial intelligence going to produce consciousness? If you take the mechanistic model, it should.
Yeah, the idea is that it has not been proven. This you said
Yeah.
it a little while ago. It has not been proven. It has not been proven that complexity leads to consciousness, which leads to understanding. Um, the the opposite, which I actually think it's the only reality, is that consciousness is everything. That consciousness exists, and will exist forever. outside of time. And in fact, as soon as you say outside of time, you also mean outside of space. And whether it's three-dimensional one and one-dimensional the other, let's not worry about that right now. But inside a black hole, you have this reversal between space and time, which is very, very interesting inside a black hole. As you go in fact, it spins more and more and more, and then you're thrown, quote unquote, into another universe, into the multiverse. But this whole issue of AI agents, um, we have associated ideas such as social media and neural networks, which eventually leads us to population collapse. And is the universe just a bunch of robots? Um, if we adhere to that point of view, then I think we're giving up our humanity. Um, we're giving up the centrality of our own being, capital B. And one may say, well, why do you think that Homo sapiens sapiens? It means Homo, the,
Knowledge.
the twice sage, twice knowledgeable. Why twice philosopher? Why do you think that the AI agents, which by the way have not been around for very long, um, why is the future going to be like that? But of course, AI comes from two words: artificial and intelligence. I would definitely agree that it is artificial, but the second word, intelligence, is I would challenge very much. Is AI is not intelligence. It is a complexity, um, approach written by in great numbers by in algorithms, as you know from computer science. But to sort of believe that the universe, if it's fundamentally conscious, that it is can be reduced to a bunch of codes, AI codes. Um, in some ways, I think it's preposterous because it has not been proven.
Mhm.
Um, but the belief in this system, I think, leads us very rapidly down the rabbit hole of not knowing where we're going, and this is really what bothers a lot young people, particularly young people. And Professor Subhash Kak, has really thought a lot about this computer science-based approach. And you find that actually in our book, the Project Omega, where we go into issues, questions as to what's the future. Let me just close this part by saying that the future, in many ways, so we know what's going to be, it could be millions, in fact, hundreds of millions of years in the future, but it will happen when the sun becomes a red giant. There's no way to escape that. And the sun will expand, definitely beyond Venus, maybe beyond Earth. It will swallow Earth and maybe beyond Mars. And when when that takes place in the distant future, it will be the end of everything that we see around us. It's actually quite, um, in a way, a spectacular way to end things that
Big
we can.
fireworks.
Yeah, exactly. The fireworks is not a supernova explosion that creates the elements, but nevertheless, the sun will expand, 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 and beyond perhaps Mars, maybe all the way out to Saturn, all the way to Titan, and maybe beyond. And at some point, the sun will shed its outer layers and become what is known as a white dwarf. And at that point, it will collapse, not in a rapid way, but it will go back to the center point that used to be the sun as we know it today.
So yeah, this is one of the things that I just want to end up that one thought on artificial intelligence, and then go into the so many topics that Project Omega uncovers. So my understanding, as well as to the extent that I've played around with artificial intelligence, and also the way the algorithms work, is that so far it's very underwhelming in its actual ability to create. It's it's okay in terms of um, uh, basically curve fitting or finding a sentence and completing it because it's read a million sentences like it. But to actually show real understanding, or far from consciousness, even we were talking about this dream state in which things arises, and for me personally, it's always been like this creativity almost arises from outside, and I just get this. It's like a gift that comes, and then it flows out, and I don't really see so far, or without despite all the cleverness of AI, that it's really uh, brings me to some wow moment. Is like, oh wow, look at that understanding that that escaped me, or something like that. So I think there's a lot. I mean, so in fact, the danger is that as it gets more and more complex, it might simulate that to such an extent that we actually don't realize that it's actually not creating anything at all.
This is
So
correct. It's simulating is the key word. It looks like it is intelligence. It looks like it is consciousness, but actually it's just a large number of complex iterations and processes. And again, there's nothing, really nothing. My wife is actually knows a lot about consciousness from the point of view of science, from the point of view of uh, what happens in neurons, neuroscience. Uh, the neurons are in the brain. We usually say they're here, but from a more expanded point of view, neurons that are in the brain do not create intelligence, do not create the mind. So the biggest mystery that we have today, and it comes from yoga, it comes from yoga vasista, it comes from Advaita Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism. I'm throwing those terms around. I think I already mentioned them. But it comes from the idea that somehow complexity leads to consciousness. But in fact, the ancient teachers, the ancient philosophers told us, they repeated many times that the mind is the foundation of everything, mind in capital M.
yes,
And, and mind does not arise from complexity, it's really the other way around. So this is an unproven foundation that complexity leads to consciousness,
absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I remember my own guru, Sri Ravi Shankar, in a
right?
meditation, saying that um, the you think that the mind is in the body, but actually the body is existing in the mind. We are in this bubble of the mind in which the body. So the mind is a field, um, and the body is moving in that field of the mind. Or
Correct, correct.
having
So
that
the
field around. Yeah.
so the body, rather than being the foundation of everything, in some ways is the afterthought or the effect of the mind. It's the other way around. And again, the usual assumption is that complexity creates the mind, and this is unproven. I mean, so we really, as scientists, I'm not wearing my scientific hat,
Yes,
we always have to question our assumptions and not
absolutely.
take them for granted. If we take them for granted, then we are just uh,
It's just one
propagating.
more dogma. Uh,
Exactly, we're propagating dogma.
yes,
Dogmatic assumptions may work in politics. We won't go into that, but they don't work in science. They don't work in
absolutely.
philosophy.
In fact, I find oftentimes, we can use maybe the term scientism for it, that some of the people who most fervently cling to this complexity model um, either have not really ever done science or worked with science, or even if they are in the field of science, um, they have not really looked at that on a fundamental level, whether that dogma actually holds water. It's just like repeated, without evidence.
Yeah, it's in some ways, if I may use, it's naivete. It's naive to think that somehow we got the truth. We know the truth. As a
Right.
scientist, I can't really accept that. And the Project Omega, it's actually very refreshing, not because I'm one of the co-authors, but it's refreshing because it goes to the limit. And the limit, the way we see it from our vantage point today, is the future of humanity, we pretty much know what's going to happen. And
Mm.
what is going to happen is ultimately interstellar travel. We're going to be traveling back to through the physical space, perhaps through a black hole or a spinning black hole into the multiverse. And it is actually a very exciting way of looking at the reality and not being confined by our present situations. Um,
Absolutely. And coming back to the book, I know uh, there's so many fun topics that we could have several hours of conversation.
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to return to the book because this is, I find it's such like a, quirky, whimsical book. I remember there was this one, there's a few favorite books like this that came across. They are very different. I remember Godel Escherbach. I don't know if you ever
Of
came across
course,
the
yeah,
book
yeah, yeah,
of
yeah.
Stader, which was
Way
a
back,
molecular.
way back,
Yes.
right?
And then there's of course the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which takes a completely different spin on it. But I think from the point of the view of the book, why Omega, and you're really throwing out questions that not many people actually are even asking. So that way, I think it's a very fascinating book because in a way it seems like fantasy, but it actually completely based on the reality that this is going to happen. We know that the star is going to end, or the sun is
Yeah,
going to.
correct.
Yeah,
Fantasy is the last thing that the book is all about. It's
exactly.
unless we think of fantasy, the ancient Greek word, to imagine. So we can
Right.
imagine the future, but actually, um, it's not much imagination because we know that the sun will become a red giant. So when I talk to people about that, that this is what we know. This is how long is going to happen. We'll say, well, millions, in fact, hundreds of millions of years. They say, well, why worry about it? Well, because we know the end, we know the
Right.
omega. And
Right.
if we know the end, we ought to be preparing for it. The dinosaurs, which were extremely more successful than we are, Homo sapiens sapiens, 250,000 years old, quote unquote. Of course, if you take humanoids, Neanderthal, man, etc., it goes to millions of years. But the ancient lizards, the dinosaurs, they roamed the earth for 300 million years.
Mm.
And then it took um, a single event, an astronomical event, uh, hitting the Yucatan Peninsula by an asteroid to make the dinosaurs disappear all of a sudden. And if it was not for the disappearance of the dinosaurs, we Homo sapiens sapiens would not really be here the same way. Um, in some ways, the dinosaurs had to go, quote unquote. They had to leave to make room for perhaps more advanced forms of conscious beings, which hopefully we are.
Mm. Unless we get replaced by AI conscious beings.
Unless we get replaced by conscious, they're not conscious.
Yes, yes,
They're
yes.
definitely artificial, but they're not intelligent. But again,
Pseudo studio conscious, yeah.
there is this boundary that's been pushed by, if I may say so, materialists, maybe naive materialists who think that, well, just make more complex things and eventually you get poof, all of a sudden you get consciousness. Um, so, but fundamental questions arise. How does the universe fit so well? I mean, it's actually an amazing thing to consider that to such a high degree of accuracy, even though the universe is based on quantum physics, which is a certain principle, how it can be so accurate and so fundamentally know we can know it to a very high degree of accuracy.
And the ratios have to be just right to make it work.
Exactly. So, it's all based on chemistry, right? Six carbon atoms and all of that. But it's something to contemplate and go beyond. In some ways, we have today the convergence of quantum mechanics and general relativity. General relativity, of course, is about the theory about the large scale structure of the universe. the Big Bang, the evolution into the future, and quantum physics is about the very small. But actually, as soon as you say very small, it's also very large because
Mm,
the zero and the one, they don't merge, but they show you the boundary between existence and non-existence. So I would say that the ultimate question is existence, being, and non-existence. And if you have being, non-existence doesn't really make any sense.
mm.
How can you say I do not exist? It's a thought, right? So fundamentally, it comes down to the mind trying to understand our own existence.
Yeah, the this existence, of course, I don't know how it works from a quantum physicist point of view, but I know from the Indian tradition, existence itself is a question mark in the sense that whatever exists in time is unreal, because whatever exists in time is by definition a wave in this spectrum of time. So if it is a wave in the spectrum of time, which is what existence is, then the real has to be beyond that ability to even exist in time.
I'm shaking my head because this is a very fundamental problem. If
Right.
time comes to an end, and we
Right.
know from general relativity, and we talked before about um, the collapse inside the black hole. If time ceases to exist, then our own understanding that is based on time sort of collapses. So in this scientific way of looking at things, it turns out that time is one of the big mysteries, and Professor Subhash Kak has actually written quite a bit about this.
Mm,
Um, the fractal time, is time really a fractal more than integer? And that gets us very rapidly into the question of mathematics.
right.
And I, I will pose a question here: did mathematics come first, or did the mind come first? And I
Right.
can tell you my own answer is I have no idea. I don't, I don't know. But we know that mathematics is much more complex than people think. People think of mathematics as one, two, three, four, five, the integers. But then the fractions, and then they're non-integer and non not fractional numbers, and then you're going to transcendental numbers, etc. We won't go into that,
Mm,
but the mathematics, in some ways, is so fundamental. But did it come first, or did the mind come first? And maybe a compromise would be that they came together.
mm. Yeah, we published a book. It's called The Imperishable Seed, which actually takes from a phrase in the Gita of Avyayam Bijam, where that concept actually is used in the very fundamental uh, creation. We don't know if it's a creation or rather a discovery of the zero and the decimal system in India. And
Right.
then that goes on to algebra, which is actually called Bija Ganita, which comes from that seed, the
See,
unknown
right,
seed. And
right.
and then it expands. And I actually didn't know much of this. That this is Professor Kamble actually wrote this book. He's a physicist as well. Actually, he wrote this book on mathematics, where many of those concepts then got developed in India, including the trigonometric concepts and the algebraic concepts. And now there is some debate on calculus as well, on how it was transmitted and so on and so forth. So there, it's certainly something very. It was very fundamental. Uh, those the philosophical ideas and the mathematical ideas were very fundamentally correlated in the Indian tradition. You couldn't really separate them. And that's why they could also contemplate these very large numbers and then very large time scales of the universe, for instance. There is this famous quote from Carl Sagan on, like about uh, ancient civilizations being able to actually comprehend that, whereas India was one of those places where they actually dealt with very large numbers and they were comfortable doing so uh, in terms of relationship to time.
Right. So you actually brought up a very important point: the relationship between time and numbers, not time and space. We know about that, but
Right.
time and numbers. And I would say it one more time: one of the greatest mysteries of modern physics is the idea of time.
Mm.
Where does time come from? And when we think of time in the human sense, we think of a beginning, birth, um, existence for a certain number of years, and then the end, the omega point. But
Yeah.
in fact, it's much more complex than that, and um, it is worth to contemplate, as Professor Subhash Kar has talked about the future of humanity. Today, I mean, now we're at 2026. By the end of the century, the number will drop dramatically, even in places, certainly in places like China, but it will then start in Africa as well. And um, by 2300, the population of the Earth will collapse. The word is strong, collapse, down to 180, 1 over 80, what is now. It will be about 300 million. This would be tremendous challenges because now we're 8.5 billion um, people. But when the number goes back to what was hundreds of years ago, before the age of enlightenment, before Newton, when it collapses back down to that number, then we have to face, how does humanity survive? Can we survive in the way that we think now? And I think a quick answer would be no, it will not. Will have to, you cannot get out of it in some ways. You cannot say, well, I just magic wand, I will wave my hands, and there we are, we have a future. I don't think it will be that simple. And so it leads ultimately to the realization that our future is cosmic. Our future is beyond the planets, is beyond interplanetary, but beyond the solar system. And then very rapidly, we go back to the question of the mind.
Mm. And of course, there is that other perennial question that has kept coming up, and we've had science fictionists answer or other things, which is, are there sentient beings on other planets already and other parts of the universe that we haven't yet encountered? And one of the book questions the book contemplates, of course, is our own. Like if the sun is going to collapse, if our population is going to collapse. I guess those are two separate things, though, because a population collapse by itself does not call for interplanetary existence, but
No.
certainly the end of the solar system would, do that.
Yeah, the end
So,
of the solar system propels us to recontemplate our future. And it's hard to believe that it's inescapable, but in many ways it's inescapable. When the population of the Earth, I'm talking about Homo sapiens sapiens, because of course the majority of the species, or the majority of sentient beings, or even insentient beings, whatever you want to call them, it's not Homo sapiens sapiens, but it is
right.
the tiny molecules that make up our bodies, hundreds of trillions of them, and very large numbers. And the question of what is our future comes down to, basically, it's a triadic, three questions or 3 points: will, knowledge, and action. These are the foundation of being.
Mm,
Before we do anything, we have to have the desire to do something.
mm,
For example, I want to drive a car. Well, okay, that's a desire. But then comes the question of knowledge. Do I know how to drive a car? You can't
mm,
say, well, I have the will to drive. You have to know how to drive. And then the third thing, which is equally important, the triadic meaning three, is can we actually get into the car and drive it?
right.
Uh, we have to have the knowledge, and then we have to drive it. So this uh, three principles, or three ways of looking at the universe, it goes back to the ancient rishis, it goes back to ancient India. Um, the triadic system, um, which also has, you mentioned the word before, Sachit Ananda. Sat being Chit is knowledge or awareness, and Ananda, which is bliss. In the West, we think of bliss as happiness, but it's really very far removed from the idea of happiness. It's the foundation of being is Ananda. It's fulfillment, if I may call it that.
And it's very closely related to infinite also, the word Ananda and the word Ananta, which is
Yeah,
the
right.
infinite. So in some sense, the sense of expansion, is the closest way I can describe Ananda. Um, the sense of infinite expansion. And,
And as soon as you have infinite expansion, you have the opposite, quote unquote, the collapse.
yes,
It's the one and the zero. One divided by zero gives you infinity, right? And
right.
zero divided by one gives you zero. So zero and one are very closely coupled, and it actually is the foundation of the mind, so to speak, or the mind tries to understand this.
So the book we are discussing again is Project Omega, Omega, the Future of Life in the Solar System. It takes us everywhere from interplanetary travel to quantum physics to the nature of the mind and what will actually happen in a very real sense, I suppose, to uh, it seems like these problems are really far away, but these are the problems that we know for certain. uh, they're not speculative, we know that.
No, no, they're not, we cannot escape it. So coming close to the end, I wanted to point to a book here. You can see it.
Sure,
It,
absolutely.
yeah, okay. It's called Science, Reality, and Everyday Life. I'm the sole author of this, and it has three chapters, three main chapters. One is the science. The first chapter is about science. It's really mostly about quantum physics. The second chapter, quote unquote, is really Kashmir Shaivism. It's mostly Shaiva, but it also has some Vedanta. And some Vedanta, I say because there has been so much written about Vedanta that I felt that perhaps the principles of Shaivism
Sure.
should be emphasized. And the third aspect is everyday life.
Hmm.
And one may say, what does everyday life have to do with Shaivism and science? Well, everyday life is really based ultimately on this duality between the dualities that we live in, which are really not real in some senses. Um, the I have coined the term uh, real reality. What is real? Well, the real reality is the existence. It is the fact that we can ask these questions. The answers we don't necessarily know, but the way it's going, and Professor Subhash Kak has talked very much about this planetary awareness beyond really what we see now. And the beyond is, I think, ultimately we will have to travel to the stars. Um, I will finish my long speech here by asking the question: why are stars so far away from each other? It's actually quite phenomenal or quite amazing
Hmm.
that the nearest star to the Earth, Alpha Centauri, is so far away that you have to travel close to the speed of light to be able to make it. If you travel with any of the speeds that we know from rockets and all of that, you will never make it.
Hmm.
So it's boggles the mind to think that, in fact, um, the stars, which have planets around them, in our case, 9 planets, are so far away from each other that to hop from one to the other is a dream.
Hmm.
Um, and perhaps the only way to do it is through space-time tunnels, through general relativity.
Wow, that's it's all of the subject of science fiction over the last so many decades. But more and more, the more we talk about consciousness and quantum physics and meditative states and the future, it seems that science fiction and fiction also seem to collapse into one reality that we have to
Yeah,
comprehend.
exactly. And I would say, if I can give a plug to philosophy, in the end, it's really philosophy. Nowadays, philosophy is considered not a very smart term. Scientists say, "Oh, it's just
Right,
philosophy," but actually, philosophy is a foundation. And if we
right.
go back to ancient Greece, to ancient India, and to ancient China, in a more expanded sense than just China, including Korea and Japan, the Far East, if we consider these three very large ways of looking at the universe, then at the end, it's really all philosophy. It's all being friends of wisdom, and we can
Absolutely,
live.
and I think in that I'm just reminded. Our time is up already, but I just got reminded this. We don't actually have a hard limit because as long as the this is the nice thing about the internet versus doing a TV show where something else has to come right after. But just to finish the thought, I know this strikes me in Ashtavakra Gita where this king is having a dream and then he's parched and the crow comes and takes his last bit of roti from him and then he wakes up and then he's like, okay, was that real or was this real that I'm sitting in the court and somebody has to help me understand, right? So this is one of the fundamental questions that people sometimes ask me to speak about the Indian tradition. I said we have two or three very fundamental questions that concern the Indian tradition, and the first one is what is real, and how do we know what is real,
Exactly. How do we
right?
know? How do we know that we know? Exactly.
Yeah, how do we know that what we know, and how do we know what is reality? I mean, how do we actually approach it? And I think this is the maybe one of the reasons that so many quantum physics sought to engage with Vedanta, because it really starts to ask similar sets of questions, in
That's correct. And the idea that we're passive, that we are just an individual, finite, physical presence, passive, of course, being an Indian
right.
word, that we're just material, if I
Yes,
can put it that way, is so far removed from even the ideas of science, modern science.
absolutely.
Not to mention, of course, all the great traditions of philosophy. That so I would like to give a plug to philosophy. It's not the last of things, but it is perhaps the first of all things.
So materialism might actually be the biggest dogma, might be the biggest fantasy in a way.
In a way, exactly right. Sankrant, you hit the nail at the head of the nail, so to speak. It is unfounded that
Mm,
somehow we can capture eternity with our current understanding. This is so far removed from really quantum physics or general relativity that scientists who study a little bit ought to know better. I'm a scientist myself, so I
yes.
can talk about scientists. Ought to know that that is not the case. And perhaps the ancient wisdoms, schools of wisdom from Greece, India, and the Far East, I would say particularly India, because India brings in the whole idea of liberation, the whole idea of enlightenment, that we are beyond what we just think as spacious. It's so
Mm.
important.
Thank you so much, Menas, and namaste to you. And
Namaste,
this
namaste.
was such a fascinating conversation that I feel that we are not the end of the conversation, but just at the beginning of it. So we'll have to invite you back again.
Thank
Uh,
you.
and
Maybe next time we can do it with Professor Cock together, or we can
we will
find some wood.
invite you
Yeah,
too.
we can.
So we couldn't get
Yeah,
a
yeah.
time where both of you would be together, but that would be a very cool jugalbandi in the Indian tradition where different musical instruments are playing and coordinating with each other. So thank
Absolutely.
you
So
again, and we will
thank you for the
catch
invitation. And again, namaste. And we hope to see each other again soon.
absolutely.
Thank you.